Hello, my name is Jim Toot, and I'm an Associate Professor of Political Science at Central Virginia Community College. In this video, we'll discuss self-governance and independence. By the mid-18th century, Britain's 13 colonies on North America's east coast stretched from Georgia to New Hampshire. Each colony had a governor appointed by the king and a legislature elected by landholding voters. These colonial assemblies, standing for the colonist right of self-government, clashed with the royal governors over issues of power and policies. Each colony and the newspapers published therein dealt with the colonial power in London and largely ignored other colonies. But the colonies were accustomed to a policy of salutary neglect, a term referring to the 17th and 18th century British Crown policy of avoiding strict enforcement of parliamentary laws meant to keep American colonies obedient to England. Then a world war, with the main conflict being in the 7-year period, 1756 to 1763, broke out. It involved most of the great powers and affected Europe, North America, Central America, the West African coast, India, and the Philippines. During this war, colonial militias fought with the British against the French. In the histories of some countries, the 7-Year War is also called the French and Indian War in North America from 1754 to 1763, the Pomeranian War with Sweden and Prussia from 1757 to 1762, the Third Carnatic War on the Indian subcontinent from 1757 to 1763, and the Third Silesian War with Prussia and Austria from 1756 to 1763. After the French and Indian War, settlers poured westward. Native Americans fought back and overran colonial settlements and English forts. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was issued on October 7, 1763 by King George III, following British acquisitions of French territory in North America after the end of the French and Indian War, forbidding all settlement past a line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains. British policy eventually pushed politics and news across colonial boundaries. In 1763, the British antagonized the colonists in two important ways. A royal proclamation closed off the frontier to colonial expansion. Second, the British sought to recoup expenses borne defending the colonies. They instituted the first ever direct internal taxes in North America. The most famous, the Stamp Act of 1765, required the use of paper embossed with the royal seal to prove the taxes had been paid. In 1765, the British imposed the Quartering Act, which required colonial assemblies to allow for the building of British troops in empty barns and warehouses. The Stamp Act was opposed by powerful interests and placed financial burdens on printers, so it was easy for newspaper printers to oppose it vigorously with hostile stories. During the Stamp Act crisis, news began to focus on events throughout the 13 colonies. Benjamin Franklin, postmaster of the British government for the colonies, developed a system of post roads linking the colonies. Colonial legislatures proposed a meeting of delegates from across the colonies to address their grievances. This gathering, the Stamp Act Congress, met for 2 weeks in 1765. Delegates sent a petition to the king that convinced British authorities to annul the taxes. The Townshend Acts were a series of acts passed beginning in 1767 by the Parliament of Great Britain relating to the British colonies in North America. 5 of the acts are often mentioned: the Revenue Act of 1767, the Indemnity Act, the Commissioner of Customs Act, the Ed Court Act, and the New York Restraining Act. The purpose of the Townshend Acts was to raise revenue in the colonies to pay the salaries of governors and judges so that they would remain loyal to Great Britain, to create more effective means of enforcing compliance with trade regulations, to punish the province of New York for failing to comply with the 1765 Quartering Act, and to establish the precedent that the British Parliament had the right to tax the colonies. The Townshend Acts were met with resistance in the colonies, prompting the occupation of Boston by British troops in 1768, which eventually resulted in the Boston Massacre of 1770. The Boston Massacre, known as the Incident on King Street by the British, was an incident on March 5, 1770, in which British Army soldiers killed 5 male civilians and injured 6 others. The incident was heavily propagandized by leading patriots such as Paul Revere and Samuel Adams to fuel animosity towards the British authorities. The Boston Tea Party. In 1773, the British government awarded the East India Company a monopoly on importing and selling tea to the American colonies. This policy, too, hurt powerful interests, colonial traders and merchants. Rebellious Bostonians ransacked the East India Company's ship and pushed cartons of tea overboard. The British reacted harshly to this Boston Tea Party. They closed the port of Boston, deported rebels to England for trial, and restricted settlement in and trade to the west of the country. The Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts were an American patriots' term for a series of punitive laws passed by the British Parliament in 1774 after the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Port Act, an act to discontinue in such manner and for such time as are therein mentioned, the landing and discharging, lading, or shipping of goods, wares, and merchandise at the town and within the harbor of Boston in the province of Massachusetts Bay in North America. The Massachusetts Government Act. The act effectively abrogated the Massachusetts Charter of 1691 and gave its royally appointed governor wide-ranging powers. The colonists said it altered by parliamentary fiat the basic structure of colonial government. The Administration of Justice Act, to assure trials more conducive to the Crown than the prejudice of local juries. The act granted a change of venue to another British colony or Great Britain in trials of officials charged with a crime growing out of their enforcement of the law or suppression of riots. Witnesses for both sides were also required to attend a trial and were to be compensated for their expenses. And the Quebec Act, an act making effectual provision for the government of the province of Quebec in North America. The Continental Congress. Once again, delegates from the various colonies met, this time at a gathering known as the Continental Congress, to address the difficulties with Britain. But this Congress's petition, unlike those of the Stamp Act Congress, were rebuffed. Repressive policies were kept in place. The Continental Congress launched a boycott of British products, initiated the Revolutionary War, and passed the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence. Issued on July 4, 1776, it announced that the 13 colonies were independent of Britain. It was designed to be read aloud in public and to be sent to international audiences. Its point-by-point charges against British rule give equal weight to how the king damaged America's economic interests and how he ignored principles of self-government. The document was drafted by Thomas Jefferson and adopted by the Continental Congress in revised form in 1776. The Declaration of Independence is a deeply democratic document. It is democratic in what it did, asserting the right of the people in the American colonies to separate from Britain, and it is democratic in what it said. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and have inviolable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration concludes that the people are free to alter or abolish repressive forms of government. The Articles of Confederation. Drafted in 1777, the Articles of Confederation were the first political constitution for the government of the United States. They codified the Continental Congress's practices and powers. The United States of America was a confederation of states. Although the Confederation was superior to the individual states, it had no powers without their consent. A confederation is a political system in which a government acts as a unit superior to the states, but is dependent on their consent. Under the Articles, the Continental Congress took over the king's power to make war and peace, send and receive ambassadors, enter into treaties and alliances, coin money, regulate Indian affairs, and run a post office. The weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. The Confederation could not raise taxes and relied on revenues from each of the states. There was no president to enforce the laws and no judiciary to hear disputes between and among the states. And each state delegation cast a single vote in the Continental Congress. In addition, 9 states were needed to enact legislation, so few laws were passed, and states usually refused to fund policies that hampered their own interests. The Articles could not address serious foreign threats. In the late 1780s, Britain denied American ships access to British ports in a trade war. Spain threatened to close the Mississippi River to American vessels. Pirates in the Mediterranean captured American ships and demanded ransom. The national government had few tools to carry out its foreign policy. There was domestic ferment as well. Millions of dollars in paper money issued by state governments to fund the Revolutionary War lost their value after the war. Financial interests were unable to collect on debts they were owed. They appealed to state governments, where they faced resistance and even brief armed rebellions. Sheas Rebellion, 1786 to 1787. Newspapers played up Sheas Rebellion, an armed insurrection by debt-ridden farmers to prevent county courts from foreclosing mortgages on their farms. Led by Captain Daniel Sheas, it began in 1786, culminated with a march on the Federal Arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts, and wound down in 1787. The Continental Congress voted unanimously to raise an army to put down Sheas Rebellion, but could not coax the states to provide the necessary funds. The army was never assembled.